Now I want to share with you my research on the astrology of the eclipses that are associated with pandemics. And we're going to have a look at the three most deadly pandemics in recorded history: the Spanish flu, Black Plague, and Justinian Plague. And we're going to compare those with the current pandemic, COVID-19. So let's begin with the Justinian Plague, which broke out in 541 AD. And was intensely active until 542, but wasn't cured and continued to recur for about 200 years until 750. This is the eclipse, which happened in December 540. First of all, it's an eclipse which occurs near the southern solstice, quite near the southern solstice. We are talking about a declination of 23 degrees south, 32 minutes. So this eclipse also includes other planets in it, which is significant. It includes Mars, because Mars is exactly conjoined to Ketu, both by longitude and latitude, or declination and zodiacal degree. So this is an eclipse that occurs near the southern solstice and includes a malefic, Mars, and it also includes Saturn, because Saturn had nearly an exact aspect on this eclipse. Using the classical Vedic system of aspects, Saturn has full aspect at 60 degrees, and it's exactly 60 degrees away. It also includes Mercury, which is, at the end of this presentation, I'll give you some meting out of how rare or not rare some of these things are. But the significant thing here is that Mercury is the lord of the other node. So the eclipse is occurring at Rahu, and Mercury is the lord of Ketu, and Mercury is in the eclipse also. And again, when I say included in the eclipse, I mean not only by the zodiacal degree, but also by the declination. Another thing which may be significant is that this eclipse occurred very close to the exact position of the node. It's less than 1 degree from the node. So those are my notes about this eclipse. Now, let's look at the Black Plague. The Black Plague occurred, it broke out in 1347, and it continued until 1351. So the Black Plague, let's look at this eclipse. Right at the beginning of 1347, on February 11th, there's this solar eclipse, and it's also an eclipse at a southern declination. This eclipse occurred at 11 degrees south, 26 minutes. Whereas the Justinian Plague was more southerly in declination, it was with Rahu, the ascending node. But with the Black Plague, it's a little less southerly, but it's with Ketu, the descending of the southern node. So that increases its association with southern things. And we know from Brihad Samhita and just common sense that southern is below and thus inferior or bad, and northern is above and thus superior or good. This eclipse, like the Justinian eclipse, also includes other planets, and those planets are malefic. So it includes Saturn very exactly by longitude and latitude. Saturn was at 10 degrees south, 59 minutes, and the eclipse was at 11 degrees south, 26 minutes. It also includes Mercury, which again is not very significant on its own, but just like in the Justinian eclipse, the Black Plague eclipse has Mercury being the lord of the other node. So the other node in this case is Rahu, and it's in Virgo, so its lord is Mercury, and that lord is also in the eclipse by latitude and longitude. It also kind of includes Mars. Mars is about 16 degrees away from the eclipse, but it is at the correct declination, so you might consider that it also somewhat includes Mars. It's also, like Justinian Plague, very close to the nodal point itself. It's 2 degrees. Another significant thing about this eclipse is it's right on the border of zodiac signs. That might be something significant. And the nakshatra is involved with this eclipse. The eclipse itself occurs in Shatabhishak, which is a nakshatra noted for health and doctors, with Rahu in Purva Palguni. Now let's turn our attention to the Spanish flu, which is much more recent. It broke out in March of 1918. It's a little bit unsure when it actually broke out because the world at that time was in a pretty strange condition, being in World War I. But it's early 1918, and it lasted until the summer of 1919. So let's take a look at the eclipse associated with that. There's an eclipse right at the end of 1917, so it fits exactly. Again, this eclipse is near the southern solstice. It's at 23 degrees south, 12 minutes, which is pretty much exactly the declination of the Justinian Plague. So in all three plagues, we found that the eclipses happened south of the ecliptic. The least southerly one was Black Plague, but that was a eclipse at Ketu, the descending node. The other two, Spanish flu and Justinian Plague, were at the apex of southernness. They were at the southern solstice, but with Rahu, the northerly node. With the Spanish flu, there's something else interesting about the nodes. They're stationary. This is an eclipse that occurred with stationary nodes. They're also Vargotama, which is a term that means that their Navamsha division is the same as their Rashi division. So, for example, Rahu is in Capricorn. It's right at the beginning of Capricorn. It's at the southern solstice. And right at the beginning of Capricorn, the Navamsha, or the ninth portion of the sign, is also Capricorn. And that's called Vargotama. Same thing with Ketu. It's in Cancer right at the beginning, where it's also Cancer and Navamsha. The nakshatras involved also seem quite significant, because you have Rahu in Mula. The eclipse itself has the sun and moon in Jeshta, and Ketu is in Ardra. So the nakshatras involved in this eclipse are all these serious heavy hitters, Mula, Jeshta, and Ardra. We also have a case where the lord of the other node is involved in the eclipse. So if in the Justinian Plague, the other node was in Gemini, and Mercury was involved in the eclipse. In the Black Plague, the other node, the node where the eclipse wasn't happening, was in Virgo, and Mercury was in the eclipse. And with Spanish flu, the other node is in Cancer, and the moon obviously is involved in the eclipse. So that's going to happen then by default anytime you have a solar eclipse in Capricorn. And guess what also happens by default if you have a solar eclipse in Capricorn? Southern declination. So eclipses in Capricorn or the end of Sagittarius tend to meet these two criteria, that they're very southerly and they include the lord of the other node. Another thing about this eclipse is similar to Black Plague. This is on the sign border. This is an eclipse on a sign border. It's actually spanning two signs. Also, the thing about this eclipse that isn't similar to the other two eclipses is that it doesn't seem to include a malefic planet in the eclipse. However, it does include Mars, because with Vedic astrology, we always consider the conjunctions that occur in the Navamsha. And so Mars is conjoined Ketu in Navamsha. Debilitated Mars is conjoined Ketu in the Navamsha, because Ketu is in the Navamsha of Cancer. And the other thing is, Saturn in this eclipse is doing awful, because it's in the sign that it really dislikes, which is Leo, and it's Vargotama in that sign. It's in the middle of Leo, which is where the Leo Navamsha is. So those are my notes about the three huge major pandemics that affected humanity throughout recorded history, and specifically examining the eclipses which marked the very beginning of them. Let's now look at the coronavirus and see astrologically how it compares with these other three. So this one became pandemic status at the end of 2019, and that's exactly when we had a solar eclipse. Once again, it's very near the southern solstice. It's at 23 degrees south, 12 minutes. This one is at the southern solstice and with the southern node. With Justinian Plague and Spanish flu, we had a solar eclipse at the southern solstice, but with Rahu, the northerly node. With the Black Plague, we had an eclipse that was southerly declination, not all the way at the southern solstice, but with Ketu, the southerly node. But with coronavirus, we get a mix of both. We get a eclipse that is both at the southern solstice and with the southerly node. And like the Spanish flu, the nodes at this eclipse were stationary. This one includes Jupiter. That should be strange, because the other eclipses for the other pandemics included malefics. This one includes Jupiter, but it's debilitated Jupiter. And it really exactly includes Jupiter by latitude and longitude. Jupiter is at 5 degrees, the eclipse is at 4 degrees, and the node is at 8 degrees. It's right there, east to west. And the eclipse is at 23 degrees south, and Jupiter is at 23 degrees south. So it's right there, north and south, and it's debilitated. So the eclipse really has swallowed up a debilitated Jupiter. It also roughly includes Saturn. At least it's in the same sign as Saturn. And it also includes the lord of the other node, just like all these other eclipses. So all 4 of these eclipses also included the lord of the other node. Also, the nakshatras involved with the coronavirus eclipse are noteworthy. The sun and moon are in Mula. Ketu is just next door in Purvashada. So it's right on the border between Mula and Purvashada, and Rahu is in Ardra. So now what I'd like to do is take a minute to just explicitly mention the common features which are in all 4 of these pandemic eclipses. The common feature is southerly declination and extreme association with southerliness. Another thing that they all have in common is there's exact conjunction or aspect with malefics or debilitated benefic. And the other node's lord is always involved. And the nakshatras which recurrently happen in all 4 of these eclipses are Mula, Ardra, and Purvashada. So what that means is, looking forward for predictive astrology, if you're seeing an eclipse at a southerly declination with a malefic or a debilitated benefic, and in one of these nakshatras like Mula, Ardra, or Purvashada, then you need to make some kind of prediction of an emergency. Now, actually, we need to check to see, maybe this stuff happens all the time. Maybe eclipses are always at southerly declinations. Maybe they always exactly include Saturn or Mars, in which case we would be predicting epidemics and horrible things all the time, and we would be wrong most of the time. So what I did was I asked people to help me do some research on this, and in particular I wanted to thank 2 people named Usman and Sarah. They gave me all the dates of eclipses between 1900 and now. So we got a sample of 276 eclipses. Out of 276 eclipses, there was only 21 that involved Saturn or Mars. So it's only 7.6% of eclipses that also include Saturn or Mars. Out of those 21, only 19 of them actually included Saturn or Mars, not just by the zodiacal degree, but also by the declination. So in other words, only 6.8% of eclipses include Saturn or Mars by both latitude and longitude. Now, of those 19, only 6 of the eclipses involved Saturn and Mars by declination, while the eclipse was in a southern declination. So that means out of 276 eclipses that we studied, only 2.1% meet this criteria of having Saturn and Mars exactly conjoined by latitude and longitude in southerly declination. And of the 276, 0 of them involved both Saturn and Mars in southerly declination. So that's 0% of the eclipses that we examined, compared to 75% of the pandemics that we examined. So I feel that these numbers bear out the fact that these are valid observations, that the eclipse, which is in southerly declination and strongly involves Saturn and Mars or a debilitated benefic, is a serious eclipse. On top of that, if you consider things about the nakshatras and other things, then you probably won't go wrongly predicting a dire event when there really shouldn't be one. Out of curiosity, I mentioned that there were 6 eclipses between 1900 and now that pretty closely matched the criteria for the pandemic eclipses. So out of curiosity, I wanted to see what events were associated with those eclipses. So the 6 eclipses that fairly closely matched, which means they were in southern declination and they tightly involved Saturn or Mars. Those 6, the first one is February 23rd, 1906. Guess what happened that year? The San Francisco earthquake. The next one was February 14th of 1934. Guess what happened that year? Hitler tried to rise to power and had a violent takeover of the German government, which failed. So it's basically the beginning of World War II. December 12th, 1956 was the third one. This year, 1956 or 1957, is the beginning of the space age and also U.S. desegregation. The fourth of the 6 eclipses that closely matched the pandemic eclipse was January 16th, 1991. What happened in that year? The Soviet Union disappeared. The fifth of the 6 that closely match our pandemic eclipses was November 3rd, 2013. What happened in 2013? The Ebola pandemic and also the rise of ISIS. And then January 6, 2019 was the 6th of the 6 eclipses that closely match a pandemic eclipse by my definition. So that means that the year 2019 is the only year in our sample. This is a very rare situation. In 1919, we get the only year with 2 eclipses that match a pandemic eclipse. I'll end by saying I feel quite confident and happy that I've identified very significant, clear, undeniable signatures of eclipses which portend dire circumstances, especially to the health of the world. And that is, the eclipse must be in a southerly declination associated with the southern node. If it's not fully at the southerly declination, let it be associated with the southern node. And intimately associated with Mars or Saturn or debilitated Jupiter. So hopefully we can use this information to better our astrological service to humanity going forward and looking at eclipses moving into the future. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.